Hey there, Four States. This is Luke Taylor, and welcome to today's edition of the Author's Corner here on KNEO 91.7 FM, The Word. And I'm filling in for Roberta Foster today. I'm speaking with Sandra Peoples, and she has a new book out called Accessible Church. It's a gospel-centered vision for including people with disabilities and their families. It's from Crossway Publishers, and we will tell you how to get more information at the end of the program all about this book. But Sandra Peoples is a disability ministry consultant for the Southern Baptists of Texas Convention and an adjunct professor for the John W. Rawlings School of Divinity at Liberty University. She teaches classes in disability ministry, currently a PhD student at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and she's talking to us today from down in Houston, Texas. And so, hey, Sandra, thank you for chatting with us about this book today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be with you.
Yeah, so Accessible Church, and this is a very unique book. I haven't seen one like this before, so why don't you tell us a little bit about it and why you wanted to write this?
Okay, yes. Accessible Church really cast a vision for including with people with disabilities and their families. So I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma, in Duncan, and I grew up with a sister with Down syndrome. And so even though we were attending church, back in the 80s and 90s, before there were a lot of disability ministries or special needs ministries, the church that we grew up in really did a great job including her and making accommodations for her, which meant that our entire family was able to attend. We were all able to go to church together. And then in 2010, my son was diagnosed with autism when he was 3. And my husband is a pastor, and so he was pastoring a church in Pennsylvania at the time, and we kind of looked around and we thought, we as a church haven't been doing a good job welcoming special needs families and making accommodations for them because none of them are present in our church. And so the church then took some steps to make accommodations for James, and then the disability ministry grew. And we've been in Texas for 10 years now, and at the church that we're at for 8. And even when my husband interviewed at this church, we kind of said, well, do you have a special needs ministry? And they said no. And we said, well, if you hire Lee, are you willing to start a ministry? Because the pastor's wife and the pastor's son can't stay home week after week. And they said, sure, we'll take whatever steps we need to take. And so at each church that we've gone to, we've been able to kind of cast a vision for what it looks like to include people with disabilities and their families. And the churches have been receptive to that. But I've heard from a lot of other families that have a member with a disability, and churches aren't always as accommodating, or they may just not know how to be accommodating. And so the book kind of cast a vision for that, what it looks like in children's ministry and youth ministry and adult ministry, to make accommodations for kids and teens and adults so they can hear the gospel and so they can be fully included in church life.
So could you tell what kind of hindrances or maybe some resistances that people have, if some of these principles might be introduced or some of these ideas are thrown out there of how to make the church more accessible for people with disabilities? What are some of the responses that you spoke of that you often get from people?
Well, part of it is that the term disability describes so many different scenarios and so many different needs. And so you could think, you could reflect on your church and say, well, are we accommodating for people with disabilities? And you might think, well, yes, because we have a ramp or we have a handicap accessible bathroom. But those are just kind of the first stages of what it looks like to be accessible. So what this book really does focus on is more like, okay, if you have a child with autism who comes to your church and feels sensory overload during the worship services, so he's covering his ears during the music, and then he talks out loud a little bit during the sermon, like how do we change not only the accessibility but even the attitudes that other people have that make a family feel welcome at a church? And it's not just in the worship services, it's in the children's ministry classrooms. Are we teaching the lessons in a way that all kids can understand? And are we making the gospel accessible to everybody? And what steps can we take to make sure that that's happening. And a lot of that is the sensory environment, but it's also the curriculum or what we're teaching and how we're teaching it. Mm-hmm. So the book gives lots of examples of how to adjust the environment to make it more welcoming, and also just for the sensory challenges that a kid or a teen or an adult would have. How can we help them regulate that? And then how do we make sure that our message is clear and understandable so that everybody has the opportunity to respond to the gospel?
And so it sounds like, if a church really wanted to be more friendly to families who have people with disabilities in their family, a lot of this probably starts with like the leadership. The pastor is going to need to communicate to the people, hey, we need to be more accepting and show more grace, show more understanding, and probably above all else, just have patience. If someone comes into your church and they're struggling with one of these things, how the church can come alongside them and be a welcoming environment for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of that starts with our theology of disability. And so the Bible has a lot to say about people with disabilities and how God created them on purpose and with a purpose, even with the challenges that they face. And then, of course, we see in the Gospels how Jesus cared for people with disabilities, how he, even in his healings, they weren't just about healing physically, but they were about restoring those people into community. And so you think about a lot of people were unclean if they had a disability, which pushed them away from community. And then when Jesus healed them, that brought them back into the community. Mm-hmm. And so when leadership understands and builds a theology of disability, and that affects how they preach about miracles and what that looks like, it matters in how you pray for people. If people are suffering or they have a disability, and then the only thing you pray for is relief or healing, then that can minimize the other challenges that they may be facing. So like I have a friend who's in a wheelchair, and she went down front for prayer one time, and a woman just grabbed her hand and started praying for healing, when what she was going to ask for was prayer that she could find a new job. And so just kind of assuming what we would think that the other person would want prayer for isn't always applicable to them. And so a big part of this is building on that theology of disability, but then looking past this attitude of pity for people with disabilities and really building friendships with them, and then becoming co-laborers where we are working alongside them because they have gifts that build up the church body just like every other member. And so finding opportunities for them to use those gifts really benefits everyone.
Well, the book, again, if anyone just tuned in, it's called Accessible Church, and it's by Sandra Peoples, who we're speaking to today. This book has a gospel-centered vision for including people with disabilities and their families. It's from Crossway Publishers, and in just a few minutes, we'll tell you how you can find out more about this book. But Sandra, and I'm glad you brought up the theology of disability, because that is something I wanted to ask you about. And, I think it's one of those things that if we're not aware enough as we're reading our Bibles, it's like, yeah, that's all through the Scripture. And then, what would you hope for a pastor out there, and maybe they're thinking, I've never really thought through this issue of focusing on how to make the church as accessible as possible for all people and all the needs that they might have. What would you hope that someone would get out of a book like this after reading it?
I really hope that they would just kind of evaluate their own actions and look around like we did when our son was diagnosed with autism. Look around their church and ask themselves, who is missing? So the census data in the U.S. tells us that 1 in 5 families has a member with a disability. So 20% of the communities that we live in have people with disabilities. But when we look around our churches, we don't always see that 20% represented. And so as they read through the book, I hope that they just look around and they think, who is missing, and what simple steps can we take that would ensure that a family would feel welcome here? And a lot of it is they need the hope of the gospel. Like, this is a mission opportunity. And when we look out at our communities and we think, this many families are unable to come to church because of the barriers that exist, whether they just feel that from experiences they've had in the past, or they've actually been turned away from churches, which I hear from families really often. But if a church just kind of reflects, and if church leadership and even just everyday members of churches can look around and think, who is missing and what is the next step that we could take that would help a family affected by disability feel welcome here, I really think a revival would break out in our communities. 20% of the population.
Yeah.
And then there's another statistic that says 84%. A family that has a member with autism is 84% less likely to attend church than a typical family. And the latest numbers for autism are 1 in 32 kids have autism. So if they're 84% less likely and they make up that much of the population, that's a huge opportunity for churches to share the hope we have and to help those families hear and respond to the gospel.
Yeah. No, definitely an untapped mission field right there, and a lot of opportunity if churches put some of these principles into place, especially if they're not doing anything in that direction already. And so I think the book like this, it gives people a lot of things to think about. And Sandra, if people want to find out more about Accessible Church, where would you send them?
They can get the book from all the retailers, from Crossway, from Amazon, and then there is a website that goes along with the book that has even more resources, and it is accessible-church.com, and there's downloads and videos and just really practical things that can help them take the steps that they learn about in the book.
Okay, well, again, the name of the book, Accessible Church, a gospel-centered vision for including people with disabilities and their families, and it's by Sandra Peoples, who we've been speaking to today, and we just appreciate her time and letting us know all about this, I think, an important work that she's put out. And so, hey, Sandra, thanks again for being with us.
Sure, thanks for the opportunity.